So a case challenging the NFA and its restrictions on SBRs is now in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court just took interest in this case by demanding that the Trump DOJ actually respond to this challenge. So let's break down what just happened. Now, real quick, if you're watching this channel, then obviously it's safe to say that you care about the Second Amendment and your rights. Now, here's the thing, even law-abiding gun owners are ending up in jail because they make a bunch of critical mistakes. And those are mistakes that you don't even realize that you're making or that you don't understand that they're illegal. So I put together a free resource called the Legal Survival Guide. It's aimed to help you guys avoid all of those traps that maybe you could fall in. It takes about 2 minutes to read. It's just a simple PDF, and it really could save you years behind bars. I made it to help you guys, again, completely free to download using the link down below. It's just something that I wanted to provide to you guys for free so that you can have it in your phone or maybe print it out. And there's a little card also in there that you can put in your wallet to give you additional resources to help you in situations. Obviously, not meant to be legal advice. I'm not your attorney. This isn't an attorney-client relationship, but I wanted to provide you guys some free resources to prevent you falling in some bad situations. Again, if you're interested, click the links down below. It's completely free to do. All you have to do is enter your email to get that free PDF. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about a very important NFA challenge case that is now in front of the Supreme Court. This challenge is called U.S. versus Rush, and it's a challenge against the NFA and its SBR restrictions. This challenge asks for the Supreme Court to find that the NFA's restrictions on these types of items is in fact unconstitutional and violates the Second Amendment. The petition also focuses on how the Supreme Court needs to finally step in and correct all the lower court confusion and defiance that's been going on since their recent Bruin decision. In this challenge, the Trump administration originally sent a notice to the Supreme Court, and they waived their right to respond to this petition, and they said that they would only respond to this case at the Supreme Court level if the Supreme Court expressly asked them to do so. Well, the Supreme Court just issued an order requesting that the Trump DOJ respond to this challenge. That's good news because the Supreme Court is now showing interest in this SBR/NFA challenge, and it's good because this would be a direct response to a lot of the remaining restrictions on NFA items, and this is good because this comes off the heels of Congress passing the $0 tax on suppressors and SBRs and AOWs and short-barreled shotguns. And if this challenge makes its way through the Supreme Court and we get a positive decision, it could be the end to the NFA and its restrictions that are remaining, being that the registry would be potentially removed. Now, for those not aware, in this case, Mr. Rush was charged with possessing an unregistered short-barreled rifle in violation of the NFA. Mr. Rush argues that the NFA's registration requirement actually infringes on his Second Amendment rights. At the lower court level, at the district court level, Mr. Rush moved to dismiss the indictment against him, arguing that the NFA's registration requirement violates the Second Amendment. The court, however, denied that motion, concluding that the short-barreled rifles in question are dangerous and unusual firearms, and therefore they're not protected arms under the Second Amendment. Mr. Rush entered a conditional plea, preserving his right to appeal, and then he appealed up to the Seventh Circuit. On review, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeal affirmed the district court's decision, relying on the Supreme Court's prior precedent in U.S. versus Miller. The Seventh Circuit found that Miller remains controlling precedent and that the NFA's restrictions are consistent with the historical regulations mentioned in Bruin, and Miller allows the NFA to still be in place and put restrictions on SBRs. Mr. Rush has now filed his petition to the Supreme Court asking for them to reverse the lower court's decision and find that the NFA and the SBR restrictions do in fact violate the Second Amendment. Now, the question presented to the Supreme Court in this petition is whether the Second Amendment secures the right to possess unregistered short-barreled rifles that are in common use for lawful purposes. In the petition, he argues that since the Supreme Court issued Bruin, courts across the country have struggled to answer the many questions resulting from the court's new analytical framework. In particular, the debate as to what constitutes a bearable arm covered by the Second Amendment has revitalized relevance. This case presents several issues that are dividing lower courts and is a suitable vehicle for this court to clarify what arms the Second Amendment protects. So one interesting thing along with this case, and it's important for me to note, is that although this deals with SBRs and the arbitrary restrictions on those items, this challenge also is seeking for the Supreme Court to clarify what type of arms are covered by the text of the Second Amendment. That could impact other cases and other issues like state rifle bans, state magazine bans, suppressor bans, and a lot of other issues. The petition argues that the Second Amendment protects all barrelable arms, including short-barreled rifles, which are in common use for lawful purposes. It challenges the Seventh Circuit's interpretation that short-barreled rifles are not arms under the Second Amendment, and the petition asserts that short-barreled rifles are in common use, citing statistics that show that there are at least 532,000 registered short-barreled rifles in the United States. The NRA, which is one of the main organizations filing this petition, they also criticize the Seventh Circuit for dismissing evidence of their widespread lawful ownership. In the end of the petition, they ask for the Supreme Court to grant cert to resolve these issues and provide guidance on the scope of the Second Amendment as it applies potentially to short-barreled rifles and other arms. And again, they want the clarification about what type of arms are covered by the text of the Second Amendment. Now, like I mentioned, the Trump DOJ originally in this case waived the right to respond to the petition, and they stated that they would only file a response in this case if one was expressly requested by the Supreme Court. Well, that just happened. The Supreme Court ordered that the Trump DOJ needs to file a response to this challenge, and that needs to be filed by September 2nd. Now, that's a great sign, because if the Supreme Court had no interest in this NFA/SBR challenge, they could simply have let the waiver sit, simply let this go to the scheduled conference that was scheduled in September, and then just denied review to this case outright after that conference. However, at the very least, this shows that maybe some of the justices on the Supreme Court are interested in this topic, and now they're going to force the Trump DOJ to file their arguments and respond to this challenge. Again, that means at the very least, some of the justices on the Supreme Court are interested in this topic. They want more arguments on this issue. And it's, again, one step closer to getting Supreme Court review and getting, broader review of the NFA at large, and, determining whether or not these type of restrictions on SBRs is constitutional. This NFA issue is a very dynamic situation right now, especially since the NFA's tax change on SBRs and suppressors, where, the big beautiful bill, HR 1, had some language included in that law where the tax is being taken from $200 to $0 at the beginning of next year. So the $0 tax change has made a lot of things change. There's been a lot of lawsuits that have been launched in response to that. And a lot of those new cases are challenging the NFA under the new $0 tax framework. But this one is one of those cases that was already teed up in front of the Supreme Court on the merits. And now the Supreme Court is seeming to take interest in this challenge. This tees up the perfect scenario and potential case to strike down the remaining restrictions under the NFA, at least as to SBRs, and then you would need probably some follow-up cases to also make their way through the process to challenge suppressors. But it would be pretty easy to get some of these suppressor restrictions struck down, especially if the Supreme Court found that the SBR restrictions under the NFA are unconstitutional. It's also going to be interesting to see how the Trump administration now responds to this petition, now that the Supreme Court has ordered that they have to file a reply. I suspect that the Trump DOJ will do something similar to what they already did, like in the Fifth Circuit with the Fifth Circuit Peterson suppressor challenge. In that case, they argued that the NFA and the SBR registry and those restrictions are constitutional, but they, said that a state cannot outright ban those items. I assume that they would probably make the same type of arguments in front of the Supreme Court, saying that the NFA and the registry is constitutional, but they cannot just be outright banned, and no state can put in place an outright ban, but they would say that the registry does not amount to an outright restriction. That would be interesting, because if they argue that in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court potentially takes that up and maybe issues a similar decision, it would be a huge win for people in states like California, New York, and others who face those type of NFA item bans. So again, a very important challenge is now moving forward, because the Supreme Court just ordered that the Trump administration needs to file a reply in this NFA SBR case that's currently in front of them. So again, good news. It seems like the Supreme Court is taking an interest in this NFA item issue. And, as this develops, as we get more information, as more arguments are submitted, and especially after the Trump DOJ response is submitted and we see what their arguments are, I will give you guys an update. So if you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to simply subscribe to the channel. Also, you can check out my website, armscholar.com, or you can just check out the free legal guide that we have available for you down below. I will leave a link. All you have to do to get that PDF is put in your email, and we will email it to you. And then also we do some follow-up emails with additional free educational materials. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.